This tutorial is really the second discussion about the history of social democracy, and I've given this the subheading of rise and fall with a question mark because, of course, the social democracy remains a political force to be reckoned with in most contemporary democracies, the US possibly excluded, depending on how you frame it. But there continues to be a series of debates within social democracy today, and concerns within the movement about how to stay relevant and how to mobilize as an alternative to the prevailing ideas of the political center and the political right, if you will, which is why I've included a question mark here. This tutorial starts with the 1930s, goes on to the 1970s, and then ends up with an overview of the 1990s, because these key moments in time really illustrate the questions that are still in many ways confronting social democracy today. So starting with the 1930s, this is really the time of social democracy's rise, because it starts winning elections. Social democratic parties in different parts of the democratic world are starting to really win elections and come to power and form governments. But even then, I've added here social democracy's problems, because even in success, there are problems, and this is really tapping into Przeworski's analysis of social democracy. So, what he says then, here's the summary of Przeworski's argument: to win a decisive majority at the polls, the working class must first of all constitute a majority of the population and vote as a bloc. And these are the two principles that social democracy rested upon. The two ideas that social democracy as a mobilizing force rested on. This idea that the working class will vote according to class interest, in other words, for the Social Democratic Party that represents them at the polls, and that the working class will grow bigger than 50% of the population, and that's the way to take control of government. However, as Przeworski points out, neither of these has ever been achieved. First of all, the working class has never been over 50% of the population. We can talk about working class, middle class, upper class, and the people who would commonly be seen as the working class, and even between working class and peasant class, and so on and so forth. So this clear idea of 50% plus one working class has never occurred. Also, the working class has never really voted as a bloc. In some countries, more strongly so than others. Sweden being a classic example where social democracy has routinely been over 30%, over 40% even, through much of the mid-20th century. And when it goes below 40%, that has been seen as a crisis for that party. But Sweden is the exception here, really. In most cases, we can talk about the working class voting and motivated by a range of different issues, a range of different identities, a range of different forms of mobilization. So it has never voted as a bloc in the way that was envisioned by early social democratic thinkers. And this has meant really that to gain mass support, the Social Democratic Party has needed to find support outside the core of the labor class. And to gain and retain office for a longer period of time, it needed alliances, most likely with the middle class, because it's a fairly close ally or fairly close by in the social structure, so it's logical to reach out to. However, doing that, reaching out to the middle classes, is walking towards the middle of the political left-right spectrum as well. And it means undermining the transformative agenda and giving primacy to the reformist agenda that I speak about in the tutorial on the division between reformists and revolutionaries. So really, this alliance, this kind of alliance, will secure votes at the polls. It will make election victories much more plausible, but at the same time, it will mean giving up central pieces of a transformative agenda, of the idea of removing capitalism and moving on to a classless society. That idea is compromised by this alliance. So it's either win and not use these ideas to win, or keep these ideas and lose. And even when it won, the socialist movement lacked a vision for how to practically achieve this democratic socialism when finally in power. Two options Przeworski talks about. One is socializing individual factories, but this would not eliminate competition between workers and individual firms. So you can create, for example, cooperatives and run a factory as a cooperative. But then what do you do when two cooperatives start competing with each other? So there is still room for cooperative owner relationships within capitalism. So this is not transformative enough. The second is to transfer control to centralized bureaucracies, which is effectively to nationalize the factories, to use the state to take over the means of production. But doing so undermines local influence and democracy. So this was the dilemma, and this was the debate between A and B for a good long time. Should the solution be using cooperatives in an organic bottom-up way, or should the state take over in a top-down kind of fashion and nationalize things? And neither of these points won out in the debate. What happened instead was that the economist John Maynard Keynes presented his ideas for how to use the state to mitigate capitalism. And this became a quite welcome solution to social democratic movements that at the time was struggling for what to do with power when elections had finally been won. And this really calls to mind Michael Cohen's garbage bin theory of decision making. This theory is based on this principle. You take two garbage bins, one contains problems and the other contains solutions, and a bunch of problems and a bunch of solutions, and you take one problem from one garbage bin and one solution from another garbage bin, and presto, that's how a decision has been made. Effectively, it says that when you make decisions, the decision making is based on what's available at hand for the decision makers at the table when they're sitting around the table. So this just really can illustrate how social democracy as a movement latched onto Keynesianism. It wasn't necessarily that Keynesianism was particularly socialist when it came out. I wouldn't even speak to that. But it was a powerful way for using the state in a time where social democracy was reflecting on how should the state be used. And that became a really powerful solution. And that started the Keynesian era, starting, of course, after World War II particularly. But this era ended in the 1970s when the Keynesian breakdown. So we can see here that the welfare states built during the Keynesian era were, of course, built on the ideas of John Maynard Keynes. So social democracy had built a series of welfare states on these ideas. And when these ideas were debunked and unable to solve the stagflation of the 1970s, the whole foundation for the welfare state as it had been constructed was suddenly in question. And the social democracy of the 1970s or 80s or 90s had no real answers to the problems because social democracy had relied so strongly on Keynesian ideas. And this can explain partly why laissez-faire economics took over the public discourse. There was a vacuum of ideas, and along came laissez-faire economics to fill the void. A response finally comes in the 1990s to social democratic to social democratic parties that at that stage had been out of power for quite a while and was struggling to get back in. And this was the third way, Tony Blair's third way. And of course, Tony Blair had great electoral success. First time a Labour government came to power in Britain since Thatcher won power. So after a long time out in the cold, if you will, Labour and social democracy got back into Downing Street. And this was done using the platform of the third way. Now, the third way abandons the classical Marxist conceptualization of capitalism as oppressive to some extent. And this was one of the points why it was called the third way. The two ways before it, according to the third way, would have been, of course, capitalism and socialism with a very state-centric idea of nationalizing industries and so on. Very much the old Keynesian principles to a large extent. So the third way then would be for social democracy, so argued Blair, to accept neither, but take the best from both worlds, if you will. Now this way received quite a bit of critique. General idea here of critique is that the third way presents a solution to the political ailments of the left at the price of abandoning the old emphasis on social justice. And here's what three commentators would say. I'll start with Kalinikos. So he would argue that the third way is the best ideological shell of neoliberalism today. Effectively, then, he calls the third way a bit of a sellout. Morrison argues that its emphasis on responsibilities for citizens over rights rests on, again, a neoliberal idea about social rights. And Bacon argued that the problematic situation extends beyond the social democratic parties to include the labor union allies. So it's not just social democratic parties that are running out of ideas, that's effectively what's being said, but the entire left and how it should think about social justice. So that concludes then a short tutorial on social democracy under the 20th century, its rise and struggles after the Keynesian breakdown.